Hi everyone, and welcome to Module 2 of the TESOL MOOC funded by the Kellogg Foundation. This is our second module, and it's about language development. And today I'm going to share with you an overview of some research and have an interactive activity to start us off. So today we'll begin by looking at some and really analyzing some statements about second language acquisition. And I'll give you a chance to respond, to think about if you agree or disagree with this statement. And then I'll provide you a little more information on some of the research involved with second language acquisition. And next we'll look at some factors that really have an impact on first and also second language development for children in early childhood, our English learners or dual language learners who are the focus of this pilot MOOC. And next we'll look at a theory called the input hypothesis from Stephen Krashen that is very pervasive in second language acquisition research. And next we'll talk about the how long question. How long does it really take English learners to acquire enough academic language to be able to be successful in an academic environment? And that's often a topic of hot debate. And finally, we'll look at program types related to providing English language instruction and see how they impact language acquisition for students who are learning English as an additional language. So let's get started. So I'm going to give you a few statements, and it's for you to look at, and think about and decide, do you agree with them or disagree with them, and why? And this activity is adapted from a TESOL publication from Staehr Fenner and Kuhlman from 2012, and it's called Preparing Effective Teachers of English Language Learners. So first of all, do you agree or disagree with this statement? Young children learn second languages quickly and easily. Think about it for a second and think about the young children you may have seen who are acquiring languages. So actually the research says that adolescents and young adults are the most efficient at acquiring a second language. It's only in developing native-like pronunciation that young children have the advantage. And we find that up until about puberty, it's really easy for students learning a second language to acquire that language with just a native-like pronunciation of the language. And usually after puberty, people can have a more of a challenging time. Sometimes people are completely fluent in English and never lose their accent. And there are, of course, some exceptions to this as well. But, sometimes it really sounds like, oh, kids, they're young, they'll pick up the language with no problems. And often that's the case for kind of playground or social language that we'll talk about more in the third module on academic language. And our next statement is that all students learn second languages in the same way. So think about this. Do you agree with this or disagree? And now I'll give you the response based on research. So we know that culture and social differences influence the ways in which students learn a second language. For example, how much they're expected to talk and to interact, if there are cultural kind of implications, for example, in how much boys and girls are expected to work together. In some cultures, they're separated and they're not expected to interact. So maybe when they're coming to school in the setting in the U.S., they might have a more difficult time interacting with each other. In some cultures, students are only, they're only expected to learn via rote learning. The teacher talks and maybe the students respond every now and then, but they're not expected to do group work. And so these kinds of things that are kind of more culturally bound will definitely influence how students learn a second or additional language. And you'll notice we'll say a second language, but second language can also mean third, fourth, or fifth language. The field is called generally second language acquisition. Our next statement is that students must acquire oral language, so speaking and listening, before literacy or reading and writing. So do you agree or disagree with this statement? Actually, oral language and literacy should be developed simultaneously. Recent research shows how oral language really does support literacy and vice versa. For a long time, our students were taught oral skills first, and then they moved on to literacy. But then that was often at the expense of them developing literacy practices in the second language. And now we found that oral language really supports the development of literacy. So especially with young learners, we want them to get, really rich experiences with oral language, with challenging, yet not too challenging oral language that'll help them develop oral skills as well as skills in reading and writing. They all support each other, all four of these skills. So the next statement is parents of English learners and dual language learners should only speak English at home. And so what do you think about this? Do you agree with this or disagree? And actually, now that you've had a minute to think about it, parents should provide a strong model of correct and really advanced and complex language. It's best for them to speak their first language at home and read to their children in the first language if that is their stronger language. And usually, the first language is going to be your stronger language. That's the language you've developed more vocabulary in, you know more of the complex grammatical structures in, and so that's the more natural language to use in the home. For years and years, parents and even pediatricians have been telling, teachers and pediatricians even have been telling parents and families of English learners, speak English in the home, speak English in the home. But actually, if your English is not developed, you're going to be reinforcing incorrect language. It's best to use the first language because it's a more rich model of language in general, and especially because first language skills transfer then to the second language. So, for example, if a student has learned to read and write in their first language, those kinds of same skills, even though the languages are different, will translate into the second language and give English learners such an advantage if they've learned to read and write and even sing and recite poetry and play in the first language. So now that we've looked at some statements that kind of frame a lot of people's thinking about second language acquisition, we'll share some research with you. And this research I'm sharing right now comes from a really recent book that came out that I can recommend, edited by Karen Nemeth, and it's called What Factors Influence the Development of First and Second Languages in Early Childhood. And so some factors are, three factors that we'll talk about right now are comprehensible input, interaction or meaningful negotiation, and getting and implementing feedback. So in the case of early childhood, young English language learners, so up through grade 3 more or less, these influences work together in a cyclical process. And research suggests that the more input a child receives in the first language, the more comprehensible it is, and the more a child has an opportunity to use the language, the faster the child will learn the new language. So we'll talk about, what does comprehensible input mean? It's really essentially language that's understandable to the student. So maybe not using so many idiomatic expressions, slowing down the rate of speech, explaining vocabulary, putting it into comprehensible terms is really important when working with younger children. And also the second point, that interaction or meaningful negotiation will help students acquire a second language, especially in early childhood. So giving kids opportunities to collaborate and to play together is really important. And so they can get practice using the language. So the more opportunities we give them to interact with their peers, the better. All children have to really be able to hear the language, see how it works to make sense of it, and they really need to use it. And the third factor is getting and implementing feedback. So if the student is maybe making a linguistic error, you could provide an example of how you use correct speech. For example, if the kid said, well, yesterday I go to the store, you can say, oh, yesterday you went to the store. That would be indirect feedback. And many times that will be, what the child needs to be able to start using the more standard language form in their own speech. So I also want to talk with you for a minute about what input hypothesis is. And this is from a linguist who's very influential in the field, Stephen Krashen. You may have read some of his works. One of his major contributions to the field of second language acquisition was talking about language input hypothesis, that language learners advance in their knowledge of the language when they're working with language and comprehending language that's just a little more advanced than their current level. We don't want to make their language so much more advanced that they don't know what's going on and don't understand, and yet we don't want to make sure our language that we're giving them, that we're instructing them in, is too easy for them. We want them to make gains. steady gains. And so this is also termed the I+1, whereas I is the interaction or the language input, and this +1 is language that's just a little bit higher at their comfort level. So for example, if their partner, who could be their teacher, is just, kind of pushing the envelope just a little bit with language in terms of complexity, vocabulary, it's language that can be understood but maybe not yet produced. So, giving them this I+1, this language that's a little harder than the level they're at, will challenge them to really incorporate new structures and new uses in their own language. And so one of the last items we want to look at is how long. So how long does language acquisition really take? And we've synthesized some research from Virginia Collier, who's a well-known researcher in the field of ESL and bilingual education. And this is from TESOL Quarterly. We've included this reading in our recommended resources to you. So this is a synthesis of her research. So she's and her partner Wayne Thomas have done studies, longitudinal data with hundreds of thousands of students across the United States, and they found that students who have been schooled in both the first language, the L1, and the L2, or the second language, with academic, complex, challenging instruction in both, will acquire to be at around the 50th percentile in academic and English use in about 4 to 7 years. And then they compare this with immigrants who arrive at older ages, so the ages of 8 and 12 with about 2 years of schooling in their first language. It's going to take them generally, 5 to 7 years, so maybe a little bit longer at the bottom end of the spectrum. Young arrivals with young being around those ages, 8 to 12 more or less, with no schooling in the first language, look how long it's going to take them. 7 to 10 years. This is with the quality instruction because they don't have that strong foundation in their first language. In adolescents, so even older kids with no English exposure and who cannot continue academic work in their first language, they might never get to this 50th percentile without some dual language instruction. And they're really at a higher risk of dropping out of high school. So it's, while we know our focus is on younger learners, it's interesting and just kind of it creates a sense of urgency for us to see what's happening with older students and to prevent these high school dropout risks. And now language acquisition for academic success, summarizing some more recent work by Thomas and Collier, these same researchers, in terms of academic programs. And this is the last slide we'll look at today, the last bit of information, that dual language or bilingual immersion programs where kids are learning, for part of the day in English and part of the day in the home language. They're really the most effective in helping students get to that academic success in both languages, which is what we really want to do, is encourage bilingualism and multilingualism. And the strongest predictor of their achievement in the second language is how much formal first language schooling and how much quality schooling they've had in the first language. And we know that bilingually schooled kids outperform monolingually schooled students after 4 to 7 years of dual language instruction. So we know that for these students, you don't see the effects right away, but it's over time, and you have to have patience, and you have to stick with your quality programming. So we really know that dual language programs, generally are the way to go when they're implemented, using the best resources and using the most effective research and the best trained staff. So these are some things to keep in mind as you work within your own programs, or you think about the programs you'll be working with and the students you'll be teaching. So I hope this has given you a good foundation of things to think about in terms of second language acquisition as you work through the rest of this module. So thank you so much, and we look forward to interacting with you through the rest of this module on second language acquisition.